So today we're going to be looking at faith in a time of genocide. So in this time of such horror, what does our faith mean? How is it still meaningful? And in fact, how can it contribute and be a core part of the way that we live our lives and understand our roles in the movements to resist genocide, apartheid, and occupation? We're going to be looking at faith as well. First, actually, we're going to start with justice as a theme. We're going to move on to how we see faith as a tool of our resistance, how it contributes to how we resist. We're going to explore the idea of imagination, and we're going to link that to theology, and how both theology and imagination can truly be revolutionary. And finally, we're going to look more closely and more deeply at the core of the Christian faith, the incarnation, the cross, and the resurrection. And we're going to discuss with one another, what does that mean in the context of genocide? So I hope that you'll find this interesting, and thanks in advance to everybody who's contributed for this, who'll be reading for us. I hope that we'll get this covered in a reasonable amount of time. We've got a lot of really rich themes to be reflecting on. So can we have the next slide? Can we, for a moment, have a think about how we would define justice? And maybe an intro question to ask ourselves to that is, what words do we associate with justice and with those themes? So if you could put some words that spring to your mind as soon as you hear the word justice, or some other ideas about how you define it, pop those in the chat and I'll read them out as they come in. John is going to read for us a quote from this last section. Thank you, John.
Great. Thanks, Emma. The timeline of justice is long. The Kairos II document reminds us that to speak of a political solution today is futile unless we first undertake the serious work of acknowledging and rectifying past wrongs, beginning with recognition of the historic injustice done to Palestinians since the rise of the Zionist movement and the Balfour Declaration.
That quote sort of speaks about just how far we have left in that arc, in that timeline towards justice. There's a long way to go, and that includes addressing those past wrongs. So we're going to move on now to how our faith can inform our understandings of justice and the actions that we take towards that justice. And casting our minds back to last session, we're going to think about a liberation theology, a liberated theology, what that looks like, what that means, and how those theologies, that type of faith that's oriented towards liberation, how that can inform our action, our resistance, our striving towards justice. And we have this quote here from Naim Atik: "Only justice that's rooted in compassion can save us from repeating the cycle of violence." I think we're going to see how faith can inform that compassion response, that response that does interrupt those cycles of violence that otherwise turn into a spiral. And yes, and maybe break that cycle that we see happening in Palestine right now. Where are we? So both the first Kairos Palestine document and this second one teach us that Western Christian theology has actively participated in the colonization of Palestine. That's a big claim to make, but the Kairos documents unpack how these are theologies that have justified empire. And I say empire with a capital E, and I mean by that both specific empires, like the British one that many of us live at the core of, but also the general system of domination, of hierarchy, of inequality, and ultimately injustice that we see embedded like systemically around the world today. And it's that theology that justifies empire that makes colonization possible. It's legitimized the occupation, it's legitimized apartheid and genocide. And that's a really huge legacy for the Western Church and us as Christians to deal with. However, both of the Kairos documents are so clear and so inspiring in their articulation of how theology can also be used as a tool of resistance and of liberation. This is a quote from a book I read a couple of years ago that I found incredibly inspiring. And it's written by a Western author, Graham Adams, who's based in the UK. It's clearly drawing on these liberation theologies that have been developed in the global south, in South Central America, in Palestine, and other places. And I'm going to read that for us now and then discuss. And so Adams writes, the kingdom of God is not simply the end point, what happens when everything is put right. It is also the route map. It's the dynamic by which the end takes shape. It is the way as well as the goal. And it is a shaking experience, especially for those who need to be shaken by the possibility of change. So we have there that faith, rather than legitimizing and reinforcing and justifying the status quo, the unequal status quo of capital E empire as a system of injustice, faith wakes us up, it shakes us by the shoulders, and opens our eyes to the fact that change is possible and that change is needed. But it also then becomes our guide. It's our route map. It's the way. It's a dynamic. It's not just something otherworldly, this kingdom. It's what happens here and now, and we act it into existence. And so thinking about this quote, about its articulation of what faith means in our lives, and in relationship to the work that we do towards justice and equality, and thinking back to that table about what a liberation theology means, we're going to go into some breakouts now. No, we're not. No, we're not. John is going to share some reflections. Sorry, John. Just to feed us some more things to be reflecting on in those breakouts. So, John, can I invite you to share some reflections about drawing on all the experience that you've got of working in advocacy for justice and equality? How has liberation theology impacted? How have you drawn on this sort of theology?
Thank you, Emma. And I want to focus really on the kind of practical aspect of how you actually, or at least how I attempt to draw upon liberation theology. And I think I'd want to begin by stressing the themes of justice, peace, and non-violence. That the principles of justice, peace, and non-violence are at the heart of liberation theology. But at the same time, whereas traditional Western theology so often focuses upon academic theologians, liberation theology calls us to listen to the people. And so our advocacy in what we do as Europeans, as people, in my case, from Britain, must always draw upon what we hear as we listen to those who are the people of the land, to the Palestinians, to those who are oppressed, to those who are suffering in the present ways. But I also wanted to pick up, in fact, what came on that quote, which I hadn't seen before, but actually the quote which we just looked at a moment ago, talking about what the way I put it is that one of the key themes of liberation theology is that the objective is also the means. And I think this actually challenges us who are involved in advocacy, because it's so easy to end up being argumentative in your presentations, and when challenged, rather than seeking to find an understanding, to end up in confrontations with people. And if our principle is that we can only achieve peace by making use of the ways of peace, then liberation theology is leading us to be aware of how we present ourselves when we're engaged in advocacy. So it's not only that we reject the ways of violence. I mean, I fundamentally believe, and I believe it's from liberation theology I gain this, you can't achieve peace by using violence. And of course, we can see that all over the Middle East, and particularly Trump's methods of trying to supposedly achieve peace, and that they won't do so. And we know they won't do so because you can't achieve peace by using violence. But then that actually challenges us as individuals to ensure that in our relationships, working with people, sometimes with people we don't even agree with, it's not a matter of using confrontational methods, but winning people's hearts and minds. So when I visit Palestine, and I try to do so every year, my objective, my aim will be to have the opportunity to sit down with people such as the residents of Khair, who are going through such a appalling time at the present time. And I do that consciously because I know that it affects the way I'm hearing the conflict that's taking place. Listening to those in the midst of the suffering affects the way we go about our advocacy, not only in giving us the passion for that, but also in allowing us to understand better the challenges that people are facing. So I hope that provides some thinking about the application within our advocacy.
The Kairos Palestine 2 document, it reminds us of the realities on the ground in very, very clear terms. Like I've seen in the chats, the importance of naming truthfully those realities, using words like genocide. And those realities often seem hopelessly awful. But the wonderful thing about this section of the document is that it also sets out some hopes and some imaginations for the future. And in a way, I think such imagining is itself a revolutionary act. So let's hear Jonathan is going to read for us a couple of sections from this part of the document, which set out those imaginations. Thanks, Jonathan.
Our aim is to live as sons and daughters of God in our homeland without barriers, walls, military occupation, and apartheid, but in a world which is justice, fairness, and equality rule. We envision a future in which our world is free of war, death, sectarianism, and tribalism, where the word of truth rises above the word of power, where legitimacy belongs to peace and justice. We draw our hope from the word of God, from the faith alive in our hearts. Our hope is for a civil democratic state grounded in a culture of pluralism, not numerical dominance, that recognizes the goodness and worth of every person who belongs to this land.
Thank you, Jonathan. Some really clear articulation there of hope for the future, which I think is really inspiring. And we're going to hear more now from Rifat, who spoke to us back in that first session all that time ago, articulating, just expanding just a little bit more on these sections and on what that imagination means.
The document rejects religious states and supremacy-based models, political models, and instead articulates a vision of civil, democratic future grounded in equality, pluralism, full citizenship, and dignity for all. Peace in this vision is not the absence of violence or war. It is the presence of justice, equality, accountability, and mutual human recognition. The document ends with a deeply theological hope rooted in resurrection, that life, not death, will have the final word.
In fact, this section begins with situating its authors as speaking, and I quote, they say, "We speak from the land of the incarnation, the cross, and the resurrection." So I wonder, we're going to think, why does that matter? Why have they put that in? John's going to read us an extract from Munter Isaac's book, The Other Side of the Wall, speaking from a Palestinian Christian perspective.
I started by saying that many of us on the call have great respect for Munter Isaac, and indeed would want to call him a good friend. And he writes this: "His crucifixion and resurrection serve as an example that life from death is possible. The cross reminds us that Friday and Saturday, times of mourning and waiting, must come before Sunday. Without the grief and tears of Good Friday and the mysterious waiting of Holy Saturday, there can be no celebration and resurrection on Sunday."
Thank you. So that speaks of that whole cycle of how we can't actually, as maybe Alison sort of alludes to, David Neuhaus speaking of, we can't just jump to the resurrection. We can't just jump to hope. Lament and despair have their time. I think that's a really important thing, that cycle of the crucifixion and the resurrection can teach us. And I'm going to add to that. I think sometimes it's so easy for Christians to jump straight to the hope, to the good news, to the resurrection. But sometimes we don't quite take the time to appreciate the agony of the cross, and particularly to think about how that side of the story, that part of the story, continues to play out in our world. We have a hope that still lasts in the resurrection, but what place does the cross have today? Where is crucifixion still ongoing? And Linda is going to read for us a poem by Palestinian poet Najwan Darwish called "Exhausted on the Cross," that speaks, I think, in perhaps deliberately provocative terms to these questions. Thanks, Linda.
The ones hanging are tired, so bring us down and give us some rest. We drag histories behind us, here, where there's neither land nor sky. Lord, sharpen your knife and give your sacrifice its rest. You had no mother or father, and you never saw your brothers hanging from the cold talons of dawn. You loved no one, and no one ever abandoned you, and death never ate from your hands. You cannot know our pain. I'm not King David. I won't sit at the gate of regret and sing you psalms of lamentation after the sins. Bring me down. Let me have my rest. That's from Najwan Darwish, Exhausted on the Cross.
Thank you, Linda. I think that's a real challenge to us, not to make the story of the crucifixion too sanitized, not to romanticize or idolize Palestinians for their, famed steadfastness. So while this poem is perhaps deliberately quite theologically provocative, it does really help us, I think, to enter more deeply into that naked, that horrific reality of the cross as suffering, as wrongful violence. To close, we're going to return to the Kairos document and to Rifat Kassis's words. So first, Jonathan, please would you read 4.5? This is the final section of the Kairos Palestine document.
From the heart of pain, genocide, and displacement, we raise this cry, a prophetic cry of steadfastness. We declare our commitment to work for the good of this land and of all humanity on the basis of our shared humanity, until the day we live in our land together with all the inhabitants of the land in true peace and reconciliation, founded on justice and equality for all God's creation, where mercy and truth meet and righteousness and peace kiss each other.
Really powerful closing words there from the writers of this document.
Kairos II sent calls and asked to churches, governments, and civil society worldwide, which my colleague, Reverend Munzer, will discuss. But to conclude, and sorry for the length of my presentation, Kairos II is not only a Palestinian document. It is a moral test addressed to the conscience of the global church and the international community. It asks whether faith will remain a language of ritual or become again a language of justice. It asks whether the world will treat Palestinian lives as equal in dignity and worth or not. And it asks whether hope can still be sustained, not as passive expectations, but as active commitment to truth, justice, and shared humanity. Kairos Document 2 therefore stands as both a warning and an invitation. A warning about the consequences of abandoning justice, the consequences of abandoning the Palestinians. No one can say that we did not know. And it's also an invitation to rediscover faith as a force for liberation, equality, and peace for all people of the land. And thank you.